Good morning. This is Talking Devils, your favourite Manchester United podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Barton, joined every week normally by, in my notes I've got by Manchester United legend Paul Parker. So I have to turn it up a little bit. I'm no less a Manchester United legend, although he never played for them. One of my best friends, Manchester United Youth historian, Tony Park. How are you doing, Tony? You all right?
I am good, mate. You?
Yeah, I'm very good. We had the heat this week. Thankfully, the summer is over. And the 2 days came and went. And now we're back to the rain.
Youth. I was just funny enough. I was saying to a friend of mine the other week that because they've been not the other week, the other day about the heat, and I said because I grew up in Sydney and people saying, "Oh, you know, you're used to it." I said, "Are you crazy?" I said, I remember leaving school when the temperature hit 100 degrees, which is what, about 35, I guess. You know, they sent you home from school, and the first thing we did was we couldn't wait to get home, and then we weren't staying inside. We went out and blinked and played in the heat when we were younger, but when we got older, we had more sense. And then when we got older, the last thing we wanted to do is, so someone said, "Oh, you know, when it's 40 degrees heat, all the Aussies are on the beach." I thought, "Are you nuts? There's no chance in a million years we were on the beach. It was too blinking hot." So. So it did take me back, and I wasn't very comfortable. And then it reminded me why I love living in this country, because you don't get those days very often.
No, and they've gone. They've already gone. I for one, welcome the rain and all its Manchester glory. Tony's joining me today. We're going to talk over the pre-season at the club in a more specific way, and also talk about Tony's best ever Manchester United youth team 11, because I was asked to do an all-time 11 the other day, and Tony usually gets roped into these kind of things anyway, where everyone's asking us, "Oh, what's your best 11 from this period to this period?" and stuff. But I named my all-time 11, and I thought when people talk about the all-time youth 11, then the best person to talk to about that is obviously Tony. So I'm glad that he's joining me today. We'll talk about Ten Hag first of all, the senior team, Tony. So United have taken a bunch of youth team players away, like they always do. Well, I say younger players, they always take them away on tour. A lot of them have really impressed. You've got the likes of Zidane, Charlie Savage, really impressive. Especially those two, because they're playing in the middle of the park and they've dictated a lot of the play. And Ten Hag's given them the chance to. He's given a lot of players a chance to, longer periods in games to make an impression. I'll ask about the youth players and how they've done in a moment, but Ten Hag, I know it's very difficult to gauge from 3 or 4 games, but United have won them all. They've scored some good goals. They've played entertaining football. A lot of the players a couple of the players who looked kind of bereft and lost last season are looking a little bit more energetic in the pre-season. It's difficult to draw too many conclusions, but are you impressed? Are you optimistic by what you've seen so far?
I'll answer the second question first. Because I'm old school, I think I'm just used to always being optimistic at the beginning of the season. And even in the 70s and the 80s, I always thought, "Oh, United are going to win the league, or win an FA Cup," because if you're not optimistic, then you might as well do something else. And even in the mid 70s when we were quite poor, early 70s when we were poor, you always were optimistic of a good season or a good cup run or something. So I think last year, regardless, was one of those very, very strange seasons. I was thinking about it, talking to some friends at the end of last season, and I'm saying I can't remember in my whole time supporting United a season so strange. Season so strange where so many people wanted the season to end, and so many people kind of got fed up, and so many people were disillusioned. And there's obvious reasons for that. So to answer the second question first, I'm always optimistic, and I'm optimistic that we're going to get a lot better performances this year. And I'm always confident that the type of players we attract to the club are capable of winning something. I'm not optimistic in winning the league. I don't think we're that good. But I'm optimistic in winning a cup competition, and I think that might be a great start for someone like Ten Hag. What I'm not optimistic about is the club's infrastructure is still the same, and regard to taking the Glazers out of the equation just for a moment, I just think the whole infrastructure at the club hasn't changed at all. We've still got the wrong people in wrong roles. There seems to be a load of chiefs all with their own way of doing something. And everybody, I've never seen so many employees at the club in terms of coaching roles and technical roles and who in the, I'm just thinking, what do they do? And everyone's got their own little kingdom that they're trying to create, whatever that kingdom is. And it's just taking energy away from the first team. And so that doesn't make me optimistic, because until we sort out our hierarchy and the structure of the club, again, taking the Glazers out of the situation, until that happens, I've always got a concern. In terms of Ten Hag, I'm happy with what he's done. All he can do is do what he's done. He's taken the right players away pre-season. He's not commenting on the Ronaldo thing. He's just kind of distanced himself from that. So nobody really knows what's going on there. I don't have any inside information at all about anything going on with that. So we just have to wait and see. He's focusing on getting the job done. I think with his selections, he's making it really clear his early impressions. So, for example, the fact that Tellez can't get a game at left fullback is really interesting. So he's made his mind up in my own mind. So he's clearly got some. Funny enough, on Twitter today, I saw a comment, someone saying that he was asked about Jimmy Garner, and he said he hasn't had an impression because Jimmy's been injured. So, but he wants to see what he's got. And there was a lot of talk last year about Matic coming on and doing things for the last 20 minutes. And I know around where I was seating, we've got some old school kind of supporters where I sit. And a lot of them were saying, Jimmy Garner can do that. We would like to see Garner come on for the last 15, 20 minutes playing in that Matic role. And he'll have more, more pace, more energy and all the rest of it. Let's give him a chance and see what can happen. So I think there's a little bit of hope for the youth players with Ten Hag giving them chances. I agree with what you're saying. I think, Rashford, Martial, Sancho particularly, they look very keen. They look like they're playing football. The interaction's very good. That's positive, particularly with the season all three of them had last year, which were disappointing. So that's good news. He's obviously after De Jong because we're missing someone in that midfield. But as you said, that gives the likes of Savage, Nick Bell a chance to prove what they can do, and they've done well.
Yeah, no, they have. One thing I'm more optimistic about with Ten Hag than I was with Van Gaal, so a lot of people are making the comparison. They both come from Ajax. The philosophy, the way that they implement the philosophy is different. We've talked about this a lot away from podcasts, that at least Ten Hag seems to be an encourager of instinct, which is a massive thing for United. So we'll see. You never know with pre-season. With Van Gaal's first pre-season, it looks like we're going to be playing instinctive. And I don't even know what football you call that. There was one time, was it Ferguson describing, it was either Milan or Red Star when they came to United I think Milan's friendly was 88 or 89 and the Red Star was obviously 91, and he called it football from outer space. That's what I think like Van Gaal's first pre-season was like, and then it wasn't. I mean, certainly Ten Hag hasn't been reinventing the wheel. You know what these players are capable of. It's very much a system that isn't unfamiliar on the eyes, and we'll just have to wait and see what it's like in a couple of weeks when the season gets underway. You talked about the structure, Tony. I want to talk to you about this. Obviously, Travis Binion was the youth team manager that won the Youth Cup last season. He's kept his job. There's been a lot of internal restructuring there, but he's been appointed head of player development as well. Mark Dempsey's leading the under-23s. Cochrane went, he's already left the club. Paul McShane's been appointed into a professional development phase role. Obviously, Nicky Butt left a while back, and there was a long period where not everyone knew what was going on with the youth system because different coaches were coming in, head coaches, Van Gaal, Mourinho. It wasn't like there's a lot of attention being put on that area of the club. Where do you feel the direction is at the moment? Is it strong? Is the Youth Cup an indication of strength, or are there still problems down there?
I wouldn't say there was problems. I think there's some challenges that all the clubs are facing. For example, Brexit's a good example and an interesting place to start. Historically, since around, I would argue, the year 2000-ish, just after the academy system started, we started going abroad for young players, and we've got a history of doing that right through to about 2018, where we would 2019, where we'd bring, I don't know, 3 to 5 players from Europe and we'd integrate them into the squad. And so that last group included the likes of Gerardo and Fernandez and Hansen-Ara and one or two others, Garnacha. And so that group came through, and now we can't do that anymore. It's illegal under Brexit rules to poach, not poach is the wrong word, but to offer contract scholarships to 16-year-old boys from other countries. Scotland and Northern Ireland not included. And as a consequence, we've had to then, if we want to develop our academy, we have to look from within the UK. And obviously every other club's the same. And so from that, it means that your scouting network is different. It means that your scouting network is now looking at 16-year-olds from other countries without being able to do anything until they're 18, because then they're an adult and it's a different conversation. And they can come across and sign professional contracts, or 17, 18, they can sign professional contracts. So the whole scouting system is different. And the view to when you see people is very different. And of course, because those countries within Brexit, if there's a Norwegian lad who's got a lot of talent, then theoretically a German club can snap them up at 15, 16, and we can't. So we are hugely disadvantaged now in terms of that. And to be fair, the quality of players in Scotland and Northern Ireland, because of the leagues they play in, means that we have to be very, very good on our scouting to find those really great players amongst a whole bunch of others that perhaps look great in their local leagues, but taking the step up to a club like Manchester United is a different conversation. So straight away you're starting to think, okay, how's that scouting going to be re-examined and reorganized? So there's a challenge for us, which is just the last couple of years. In addition, you've had COVID and you've had the lockdown, which has made things incredibly difficult to do all these things. I know for a fact that a lot of the United coaching staff have not been allowed back in Carrington for 3 years, and that's people who work there. So that's been and by the way, that's a United decision. That's not a government decision. That's just United being incredibly careful about how many people are allowed back into Carrington. I mean, supporters are still not allowed back. So they're minimizing that as well. And that has to upset the infrastructure, because certain coaches who were once there doing whatever they were doing, they can't do that, or they're doing it by Zoom, or they're doing it virtually or whatever. And that must be incredibly, not upsetting in terms of the players are upset, but upsetting in terms of structure.
Yeah.
And then you've got all these changes with the coaching staff. And so as a consequence, there comes a point when you, and it depends on how you look at it, there comes a point in which says, where's the stability and where's the consistency? So I like the idea of Binion being kept in his role. Paul McShane knows the club. He's come back in. He had a role last year as a player kind of development coach. He's maintaining that, or moving into a more long-term, a full-time role. Mark Dempsey's been around a little while. He's come and gone. So Mark knows the club. That's good news. We've lost a few people like Neil Ryan to bear with me. My alarm's just going off. We've lost a couple of coaches, Neil Ryan and others, to different roles. Neil Wood as well, and that's okay. That's evolution. So in terms of health, I think the health at the lower levels is really hard to gauge, and also no one's got line of sight. So, for example, because we're not able to see the under 14s and under 15s and even the under 16s, there's just no line of sight any longer. No one really knows what's going on. There's a few people on Twitter and on the forums that you'll see on social media. For some reason, they have access to intelligence, and they tend to post stuff that gives you a little bit of insight. But for the most part, no one really knows what's going on at low level. So what you do have to do is you have to then look at the strength of the club from under 18 level, which is the FA Youth Cup. And the fact that we went through a long period, Wayne, where we underperformed, consistently underperformed. We were knocked out in the early stages on more than 3 or 4 occasions. And that's just not good enough. What we then had was the last season of Brexit. We got to the semi-final. I don't know if you remember, they were both played at St George's Park in a one-off game. Yeah. We lost 1-0 to City or Chelsea. We didn't win, lost by the odd goal. And that was good that we got that far. And then last season, of course, we went that one step further, and we were by far the best team in the competition, as proven by the clubs who were highly thought of, the Evertons, the Leicesters, the Wolves, and even the Nottingham Forest, who defeated Chelsea. They were highly thought of clubs. We played really well. We had a very strong core, and many of those players can play next season or this season. So that's fantastic and really augurs well. And the other great thing is that, our record in the FA Youth Cup, when it comes to player development, 7 out of 10 historically, I think it's 69 point something percent. So 7 out of 10 players who play in an FA Youth Cup winning team go on to play first team for United. And out of those players, they all have careers in the game. So if you're part of an FA Youth Cup winning team, that's a really good sign that, one, you've got strong development practices going on, but two, the quality of players are gonna excel in football. Now, of those percentages, 3 usually have a good career at United. So the question then is, out of last year's team, which of the 3 who potentially could have a really good career at United? Garnacho is the one that's broken through, but we've been talking about Charlie McNeil, we've been talking about Kobe Mainu, Maxi Oideli. There's loads of names being talked about as having really good chances in that team. Isaac Hansen-Aaron we've mentioned. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. But winning the Youth Cup definitely is a benchmark of the strength of an academy. I think so, anyway.
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting thing because we've never. I mean, United have had many, many scenarios over the history, but they've never had a scenario where they've changed a manager straight after a Youth Cup winning team. So it's going to be very interesting to see how many of those, like you said, on average, 7 players get a chance in the first team. So hopefully they will. We've got a question from Mike before we move on to the best youth team 11, Tony. He asks about the Brexit rules changing.
Yeah.
The Brexit rules for young players. Is there a way to get around it by using affiliated clubs within the EU to have young players develop there? Is that possible?
Hi, Mike. How are you doing? We've spoken before, obviously, so we know each other. Yes, there is. You'll probably remember, or you might be aware, Mike, that we had an affiliation with Antwerp many years ago, and we would send our own youth players there for specific development. But also there was a number of African players and a couple of South American players from memory who also went there as this kind of holding space just to see if they were going to develop before we brought them into the UK. Now, it never really worked out in the way that we wanted it for a number of different reasons. And I think the big challenge is, yes, we could scout these players at 16, 17, but do they really then want to say, okay, I'm signing for Manchester United, but I've got to have 2 years at Antwerp? And that's the challenge, because that's not Carrington. That's not the United youth structure. That's the Antwerp youth structure. And so I think the real challenge with doing an affiliation is that in the UK, we don't do what they do in Europe. For example, in Spain, where Barcelona's youth team plays in the 3rd or the 4th division of Spanish football. So they have a completely different structure of how they bring kids through. We would have to find another relationship with someone like an Antwerp, which is very possible. But you then have to say, how do we pick the club to start with? So you're trying to pick a club that is not too good, if that makes sense, that they're just going to take all the players anyway.
Yeah.
But the club's good enough that the challenge for the young kids coming in is something that's interesting and motivating, and there's a definite pathway. And I'm not close enough to the club to know if they're thinking about that. I'm not close enough to the club to think that have they identified. I think personally, I'm a bit, particularly with the way in which Dutch lads tend to progress, and clubs like Ajax have got a fantastic youth record. Theoretically, you'd say, is there a 2nd or a 3rd division club in Holland that could be that kind of affiliation? Would they be willing to do it? Because of course, the other thing is, if they're playing our youth players and then we're taking them away, then theoretically that's not opening up spaces for their own youth players.
Yeah.
So it's very complicated. And even though other English clubs have tried it, I don't know where it's worked. If someone said to me, find a club out there that has got a track record of using an affiliated club as a breeding ground for their own youth players to bring into another country, name that club, because I don't know one. So it's really hard to do. You've got to be, you've got to tick every single box 100% to make it work. So yes, the answer is yes, it can work. It's possible, but I think the risks are really high.
Yeah. I do remember some great stories. Danny Higginbottom telling me about when he went to Antwerp. Obviously, famously, he had the massive issue with Ronnie Wallwork with the referee. But yeah, a different time indeed. But yeah, interesting thoughts there, Tony. So all right, so let's get on to the meat of the matter. The all-time best Manchester United youth team 11. Start that comment again, even though I dropped it back up for some reason. Okay, before we get into the team, I want to know the formation that you're going with, first of all, Tony. No spoilers, but you can see most of the lineup behind you, so it looks like it's a 4-4-2. Are we going with that?
I think so. I mean, when I looked at all the different players that I considered for the team, it's scary. It really is scary because you could play any formation you want. You could play 4-2-4. You could do 2-3-5. You could do 4-3-3. I'm going to add a couple of spoilers in there. With a few of the players that we've got in the team, you could either not even play with a keeper. You could just say we don't need a keeper with this group because they're just such a good crop of youngsters. So, which obviously we're not going to do. We will have a keeper. So yeah, I've gone 4-4-2.
Okay, so who is the goalkeeper that you've got in your net?
So funny enough, out of all the positions, this is the one that United really haven't excelled in terms of youth development. So I came up with a handful of names. I came up with Mark Bosnich, who had a very good career after leaving United as a junior. He was here for a couple of years, and he obviously went to Villa and the Australian national team. I looked at Gary Walsh, who was very well thought of by Ferguson before he had the injury in Jamaica, and he got kicked in the head and suffered an incredible amount of confidence loss, and that affected his game because he was very well thought of. So the three players I kind of looked at to say, well, who would be in my team? And the way that I've done this, Wayne, is I've picked a first choice and a backup, so a subs bench, if you like. So the three choices were Dean Henderson, who I think of all the modern keepers is an England international. He is one where you could probably suggest that there's a big chance that he could take the spot. David Gaskell, who is the youngest player ever to play for United when he came on in the Charity Shield in 1956 as a substitute for Ray Wood when he was injured. And he's our youngest ever player in a competitive game.
Yeah.
And the third player I thought of was Jimmy Rimmer, who was a very, very reliable goalkeeper and actually took over from Alex Stepney in the early 70s when Wilf McGuinness dropped Stepney and put Rimmer into the team. And funny enough, with those players, apart from Gaskell, they were all very close to or had international experience. So they were the three kind of choices I was looking at. And in the end, I went for Jimmy Rimmer simply because of his longevity in the game, both with United, Arsenal, and Aston Villa. Still one of the only goalkeepers to win European medals, European Cup winners' medals with two different clubs, having only played limited minutes on both occasions.
Yeah.
So I put Jimmy Rimmer as my number one choice. And funny enough, Tommy Doherty told me a story because I asked Tommy, when you arrived at the club and you sold all these players and brought all these players in, do you have any regrets? And he said, yeah, I have two regrets. And Jimmy Rimmer was one of them. He said, I should have kept him. I made the mistake of thinking that Paddy Roach was going to be good enough, and he wasn't. And Alex Stepney was coming to the end of his career, and I thought I should have kept Jimmy Rimmer. So on that occasion, I thought I've chosen Jimmy Rimmer as my keeper with Dean Henderson as the backup.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Jimmy Rimmer's an exceptional man as well. I love him to bits. He's great. And yeah, one of those things, like you said, not many have gone on to establish themselves in the United team, but like you mentioned Bosnich earlier, there are a couple there who've gone on to have great careers. It is funny because Busby's tendency was to break the world record for a goalkeeper. He just kept doing it many times. So it's the one area that he could never quite get as he wanted. And he did have that dream. And by the way, did fulfill it of fielding an homegrown 11, which he did. Is it Spurs 57? When he played the full 11, Gaskelin goal. They all came through the youth academy. Okay, so that's the goalkeeper, Jimmy Rimmer. And who have you gone for in defence? You can see two names behind you, but
these were names I'm playing with. So that this isn't actually my final team, although some of them are. So in terms of fullback, what was really interesting when I was doing the research is that a lot of the fullbacks can play both sides, and they did play both sides. So people like Johnny Carey, for example, could play left fullback, and well, Johnny Carey could play anywhere.
Yeah.
But on the right hand side, I came up with four names that I thought were really good, solid names for the team. Shea Brennan had a long career at right back, originally an inside forward. I've mentioned Johnny Carey. Gary Neville is the obvious choice. A long and illustrious career as a United right fullback and captain. And the other one was Mickey Duxbury, who I think is one of the most underrated fullbacks in our history. Over 10 years at the club, could play multiple positions. He got 10 caps for England at right back. A really, really good, solid professional who would not let us down in today's team. And I would pick him in any normal team as a given. However, my choice of right back, really because of their captaincy capability, would be Gary Neville and Johnny Carey. And I've chosen Neville over Carey simply because I saw Neville more at international level and first team level than I did. Although everybody tells me that Johnny Carey was an amazing footballer. So my right back is going to be Gary Neville with Johnny Carey as the backup.
Okay. And what about your centre halves?
I'll go left back first, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
So on left back, that was even harder because we've got people like Jimmy Nicholl, Phil Neville, Johnny Aston Senior, who was a wonderful left back, one of the first United players to win international caps after the war. Incredibly well thought of. Another inside forward who was converted to left back by Matt Busby. Francis Burns, Lee Martin. We've had some really, really good left backs. But the three that really stood out to me were Roger Byrne as a left back, Arthur Orbiston, and a player called Bobby Noble, who most people might not have heard of. Bobby Noble was in the '64 Youth Cup team and was destined to win England honours. He was in England under 23s. He just broke into the United team in the '66-'67 championship season. He'd basically taken over from Shea Brennan, and Shea Brennan even said in a newspaper article, I'm probably going to have to retire because I'm never going to win my place back. And then unfortunately, Bobby was injured in a car accident, and that wrecked his career. So what I've chosen here as my choice is I've chosen Roger Byrne as my number one choice, with Bobby Noble as the backup. And Arthur Orbiston is so unlucky because, like Mick Duxbury, he could walk into today's team very Dennis Irwin-like and not let anyone down. We've been very blessed. So my choice at left back, and again, don't read too much into the stuff behind me because I was playing with names on a spreadsheet. So my left back is Roger Byrne with Bobby Noble as the reserve.
Okay, and the centre halves.
Two positions. So a load of names here I could have thrown around. Mark Jones, Jackie Blanchflower, Billy Garton, Graham Hogg, John O'Shea, even Gerard Piqué. Gerard Piqué would be one that a lot of people would say, well, why isn't he in the team? Gerard didn't really do it at United. He played 20 or 30 games, did okay, but I think the pace of the Premier League or the First Division, whatever it would have been, just wasn't right for his style of football. So that kind of left me with four players, and those four players were Wes Brown and Johnny Evans from the more recent era. And Wes Brown has to be one of the most technically gifted young footballers I ever saw in that position. Yeah. Ferdinand-esque in his way of playing, but just unfortunately always had injuries. Hard as nails, Johnny Evans, nearly 100 caps for Northern Ireland. I think a lot of people even now suggest that perhaps we let him go too soon, and we should have kept Johnny Evans. That's a thought that many people have, and I kind of agree with that. Bill Fowkes, a stalwart of United throughout the 50s and 60s, 600-700 games for the club. Never let you down, if not flash, but just did a job. And then Nobby Stiles, World Cup winner, aggressive, tenacious, could play in midfield, could play sweeper, could do a man-to-man marking job. Of all of those 4 players that I looked at, he's probably the most versatile. So the 2 I chose as starters were Wes Brown and Nobby Stiles. I thought they complement each other really well. And then the backups would be Bill Fowkes and Johnny Evans.
You've got 2 sweepers there in the back line.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. Pretty Tommy Docherty of you there, Tony, to go.
Well, I like the versatility of both those players. And, Wes Brown can slot in at right back and Nobby Stiles can move into midfield. And you've just got a lot of pace in that back line as well. Roger Byrne was quick as hell. Neville wasn't a slouch in his heyday. And Brown was quick. Stiles was, there's a lot of pace there as well.
Yeah. Brown, I completely agree with you. If not for injury, I think there's a good chance he's got a shout to be the most naturally gifted centre-half that we'd ever produced. He was unbelievable. Okay, so you've gone with any great Manchester United team has to have a couple of wingers in there. So let's start with let's start with the midfield, the actual central midfield before we get to the attackers.
Man, that was difficult.
Yeah.
Do you know what was difficult? Was not picking the 4, because the 4 that I've got there, not many people would argue. It's then looking at who you're missing out. So, I looked at, John Fitzpatrick, Wilf McGuinness, Scott McTominay. He divides opinions in modern day fans, but he's played nearly 100 games in that position. That central midfield role. Nicky Butt. I thought, wow, Nicky Butt, what an underrated player Nicky Butt was. He would walk into most teams. Tom Cleverley, Jesse Lingard. There were so many players in that midfield area that it was just who to leave out. But in the end, 4 players just kind of were a little bit, not even a little bit, they just head and shoulders above everybody else. And you can probably see it in the background. They were Duncan Edwards, Paul Scholes, Norman Whiteside, and Johnny Giles. And we never really saw Johnny Giles do it at United because it was kind of shifted to the wing by Matt Busby on a lot of occasions. It was only when he moved to Leeds and played the centre midfield role that he came to his own.
Yeah.
But he'd always played in that midfield place in our junior teams to incredible effect. So he's one of the 4. Norman Whiteside, a boy among men, could do whatever he wanted to do. Fantastic left foot. Terrace hero for so many Stretford Enders and other fans. Winning goals in cup finals, youngest player to score, youngest player to play in the World Cup. He broke record after record. Hard as nails. He moved from the front line to the midfield when he lost a little bit of pace. Incredible player. Unfortunately for both Johnny Giles and Norman Whiteside, there were just 2 midfielders that we produced who were better. And I don't think anyone would argue with either Duncan Edwards, one of the best players in our history, or Paul Scholes, the same, taking those 2 midfield places. Both of them hard as nails. They could manage themselves. Both score goals. Both dictate midfield. Both great personalities. Talk about leadership qualities. They had that as well. You put them 2 together. Even take away a youth team. If you look at that 4, you're only talking about Robson and Keane, who could probably break into that 4. Outside of that youth, that 4 in youth, Edwards, Scholes, Giles, and Whiteside. I can't think of any other club who's had 4 central midfielders as good as those 4 coming through midfield.
I was going to say, just in a theoretical response, you could have those 4, and 2 players that you didn't mention that if they were the starting midfield at any other club, they would be their best ever midfield. And I'm just the two names off the top of my head were Coleman and McGuinness.
Yeah.
You could have those as the starting midfielders, and they would have been, like I said, they were Arsenal's starting midfielders at that time. That they would have been considered the best in their history. And that's how high the standard is.
Yeah, and players that I didn't mention, which are on my list when I looked at it, Eddie Coleman, Billy Whelan, Sammy McIlroy. I mean, one of my favourite ever players, Sammy Mac. He can't get into that team, not because he's not good enough, but because of the 4 players ahead of him.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that. And then the other 2 players, Clayton Blackmore had a really good career in midfield, although he was also considered as football. But the one player who I think was Darren Fletcher. I thought Darren Fletcher was an amazing midfielder. But again, you're going to drop Duncan or Paul Scholes to put Darren in? No, and Giles and Whiteside were probably a little bit, just had that little bit more. So if you were going to push me, which you haven't, but if you're going to push me for which other 2 would you go in, you could pick 2 from McIlroy and Fletcher, and they would never let you down. Amazing midfield.
You could win a title with those in midfield today, for sure. Edwards and Whiteside, they were 2 players that United signed like early teens or mid-teens, and already as soon as they signed them, the conversation was, when are we putting them in the first team? How long are they going to be spent rampaging through kids that are half their size? Even though
that's a great comment, Wayne, because both of those players made their debuts at 16.
Yeah. So they didn't wait for very long at all. Okay, so another area United have been blessed because wingers. I mean, Busby was very fond of saying this, but it's definitely true. Wingers are like almost the most precious commodity in the game. So to develop them, as United did so often in many different ways. I mean, God, I dread to think of the names that you've left out here.
Well, this was really interesting because I thought the same as you. I thought, this is going to be really interesting, even though people are going to have, no surprises, I guess. But when I got to the right wing, I actually thought the right wing was actually easier than I thought it was going to be, because most of our right wingers in history we've brought in, we haven't actually developed. The three that I looked at were Ian Moyer, who was a really good little right winger, but his career kind of got stalled because he got injured one day, and then they put Georgie Best in, and unfortunately that was the end of Ian Moyer's career. So Bestie was the right winger, and David Beckham was the other obvious candidate. But after that, we haven't really developed, right wingers in the same way that we've developed left wingers. So on the left, we've got the likes of Charlie Mitten, we've got the likes of Johnny Aston, obviously Ryan Giggs, Mason Greenwood, David Pegg, Albert Scanlon, Kieran Richardson, Johnny Aston Jr. There's a lot of players there that you could pick from. But you could probably see it on the screen. It's very hard if you've got Best and Beckham on one side to have Charlton and Giggs on the other. And Bobby Charlton played 5 or 6 seasons of his career in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s on the left wing for both United and England. So I've decided to put him on the left because otherwise he wouldn't have got in midfield over Duncan Edwards, and I wanted him in the team. So I've decided to put Bobby Charlton on the left wing with Ryan Giggs as the backup. But you could pretty much pick any of the others as the third choice. But my third choice would probably be Charlie Mitten, because everything I've read about Charlie Mitten was he was an outstanding footballer in every single way. And, he would have entertained the crowds of today in a way that perhaps only Giggs and Best could have done. And if you've read his book, the Bogota Bandit, it's just a fantastic illustration of how good he must have been, and the frustration Busby must have had with him in terms of, trying to teach him tactics when he was a kind of free spirit. But so my wingers, Bobby Charlton and George Best, no surprises. I think it'd be hard pressed in any team to get better than those 2. Ballon d'Or winners, 2 Ballon d'Or winners to come through our youth system. Not many clubs have got 2 youth players as Ballon d'Or winners, with Giggs and Beckham as backup. It's not a bad backup either.
All European Cup winners.
Yeah, every one of them.
You mentioned the right wing, and you're quite right. United have historically struggled there. In the early, I think it's more to do with the class of '92, really, and how ridiculously blessed we were with wingers in that squad. You had Simon Davies, Ben Thornley on the left. You had Keith Gillespie on the right. Obviously, Giggs could play both sides, and he often did, and through the middle up front because they were obviously Aidan Doherty as well. God, I mean, the list goes on. Gillespie, just a fantastic player, played in the European Cup. Terry Cook, a little bit later, broke into the first team. I was looking the other day at the game against Bolton in '95, where Cook looked like he was going to be a world beater. But yeah, it was a strange blessing around that time to have that many, and because, I mean, as we all know, wide players are a precious commodity in the game. But yeah, that just, you can't argue with that pick there. Tony's best in Charlton.
Well, I was trying to look for players who played 50 first-team games, so you could actually say you're comparing like for like. So, yeah. Unfortunately, the Terry Cooks, didn't play that many games, and Adrian Doherty, of course, was injured before he got to the first team. So I kind of, had to discard them. But even if they played 100 games, you still got to be better than Best and Charlton to get into the team, and that's difficult for senior internationals. So.
Yeah. So we mentioned goalkeepers and how difficult it is, and because Busby would usually buy them, and they'd usually be such an established presence in goal anyway, that because it's a singular position, it's very difficult to rotate. So that's probably a big reason for why these players didn't get the chances that they could have done. I mean, we know the likes of Kevin Walsh went on to have a great career once he left. Well, like a good career once he left United. He was great at Middlesbrough. Kevin Pilkington had a long career as well.
Steve Pears had a very good career at Middlesbrough as well. For 8-9 years or something, he was up there, had a testimonial up there. He played a lot of games for Middlesbrough. Very good career.
And Henderson, by the looks of it, probably away from United. Well, maybe away from United, but he'll probably have a great career as well. So it's not like they don't develop good goalkeepers. Like we already mentioned, Jimmy Rimmer went on to win the European Cup. It's just that with it being a singular position, it's quite difficult. Yeah. And that brings me into the point about the forwards, is that it's a kind of like a similar story there, because goal scorers are like the second most difficult thing to get in football after a winger. The goal scorer is so difficult to create because everyone's always talked about them being born with the mythical instinct of being able to score goals. That's something as old as time, as true today as it was in the 1950s. So United haven't always developed a lot of great strikers. However, when you look at a youth 11, they've still developed enough that you would say that's the envy of most clubs. So who have you picked in your front line?
Well, again, looking at the forwards, there was some choices. We had people like Brian Kidd, Andy Ritchie, played really well in our forward line. I've mentioned Welbeck. He could also play up front. Mason Greenwood played, along the forward line at centre forward as well. People like Johnny Morris. So we have had players who have Alan Gowling's another one. So we've had players who have done really well up front, but the ones that have really stood out made it a relatively easy choice. And there is one player that I will talk about in addition. So I came up with 4 names, which I then just had to work out which 2 would start and who would be backup. And the 4 names were Stan Pearson, who most people won't have heard of, but he joined United through the Salford Adelphi Lads Club before the war, and as a 17-year-old, and was almost drafted immediately into the first team. He was that good. His career was upset by the war, obviously, but he still scored 100 odd goals in 300 or 400 games for the club. Part of the 48 team who won the FA Cup, also won a league title in 51-2. A very underrated player from everything I've read. Made the team tick up front. More of a creator for the likes of Rowley and others, but had a great goal scoring record. In fact, he's one of the few players who scored a hat trick in an FA Cup semi-final. So he's in the 4, along with Dennis Violet, who was one of the spearheads of the Busby Babes throughout the 50s and early 60s. He still holds the goal scoring records in a season, 32 league goals, which is still yet to be beaten by any player in a single season. And that's league goals, not total goals.
Yeah.
Quick, fast as lightning, great partner to the fantastic Tommy Taylor in the Busby Babes halcyon years. And then alongside the other two players I thought about were Mark Hughes, who's probably the strongest, most bravest, most physical forward that I've ever seen play the game. And I'll include Joe Jordan and Mick Harford and others in that category. He was just a beast. And players hated playing against him. Funny enough, if you ask Paul Parker always played well against Mark Hughes, and Mark Hughes hated playing against Paul Parker, and that's because Paul didn't play the physical game with him. He was just quick and nippy and would out sprint him, out jump him, quicker to the ball, all that sort of stuff. So Mark never used to have great games against Paul, but Mark Hughes was a scorer of great goals. I don't think anybody who saw Hughesy play will forget some of the volleys that he scored in big games. Liverpool in the semi-final of the FA Cup, he scored in finals. Amazing player.
Romantic goals as well, wasn't he? It's like he had a sense of timing. It was like there was always a sense of romance with Mark Hughes.
Unbelievable. And if anybody wants to see Mark Hughes, pure excellence, go on YouTube and look at his goal for Wales against Spain. He did a volley that is just exceptional. And so he was obviously one of my four. And I've also included Marcus Rashford. He's 100 goals for the club. He's had a great career up to this point. He didn't perform well last season, but that happens to players. Fast, quick, scores in big games, England international, and still a lot to give. I think still a big career ahead of him. So they're the four players I went for: Stan Pearson, Mark Hughes, Marcus Rashford, and Dennis Violet. The fifth player I considered was Alex Dawson, who has an amazing goals to games ratio. Off the top of my head, it's the highest in our history. I think he scored something like 40 or 50 goals in 70 or 80 games, which is better than Van Nistelrooy, better than Ronaldo. So an amazing ratio, but he didn't just have the quality of the four players that I chose. So what I've done here is on the chart is I put Hughes and Pearson just behind Violet and Rashford. So I put Mark Hughes in a kind of 10 role, Dennis Violet in a kind of 9 role, spearheading the attack, Marcus Rashford as the backup to Violet, Stan Pearson as the backup to Hughes. And then I've got two players that I think both can score goals, both can bring others into play, fast, physical. It kind of ticks all the boxes. And if you can imagine Mark Hughes with Charlton, Best, Edwards and Scholes behind him, there's enough physical power there. And if you look at Violet and his pace, and he's got Best, Charlton, Edwards and Scholes behind him, those front two will just score a shed load of goals.
Yeah, it's quite intimidating. You got Styles, Noble, Edwards, Hughes. They're just not going to lose a fight.
Well, that's true. So the team is Jimmy Rimmer, Gary Neville, Roger Byrne, Wes Brown, Nobby Styles, Paul Scholes, Duncan Edwards, George Best, Bobby Charlton, Mark Hughes, and Dennis Violet. And that team has pace, international quality, Ballon d'Or excellence, physicality, winning mentality. You name all that. You tick all the boxes that what makes a winner, and none of those players lack any of that at all.
Yeah.
So, and that's from players we've developed. Every one of those came through the youth system. Every one of those has been developed by the likes of Walter Crickmer and Jimmy Murphy and Eric Harrison, and Paul McGuinness. All of those people have been instrumental in developing what I think is an exceptional team.
Yeah, but Edwards would have certainly won a Ballon d'Or as well. There's no question about that.
I think he was equal second or equal third in the season before he died. So, so he was already well thought of in European circles, even though he was only 20 years old.
Yeah. Obviously, there's always a special case for this. Ravel Morrison always gets mentioned. I know he didn't play enough in the first team to get the nod in your team, but everyone always talks about him as possibly the most gifted player. You've certainly spoke about him in those terms. He's recently just signed for Wayne Rooney's DC United, and I think someone said it's his 17th club, so he's obviously been around a bit. He's obviously had a lot of struggles in his life and a lot of struggles to settle down. But obviously, anyone who saw him play for the youth team, and this is a team that had a World Cup winner in it, in Paul Pogba, a future World Cup winner, and Morrison was just the best player by a distance in that side. And you've spoke about him in terms of, I mean, Ryan Giggs, like, there's the two that have stood out for you when you've been watching youth football. Is it a case of romance? Do we look back and think, oh, what if with Morrison? That because I tend to share the same opinion as you in terms of looking streets ahead, like they're an adult playing a kid's game. Morrison was that to that generation that Giggs was to that one. Talk to us about Ravel Morrison and how unique he is in United's youth history.
How do I say this? Every now and again, and everybody's different, okay? Everybody sees something different. So you watch a youth game, and I've been watching youth games since the 70s. And every now and again, you see a youth player, and you look and you go, oh my God. And it doesn't happen very, very often. You go, they're going to be a dead cert. They are going to be a player in the game. Now, the only thing that you don't know at that level is, well, here's what you do know. Because you're watching them play, technique is a given. So you know they've got the technique. So the thing you then worry about is physicality. And you're saying, are they going to manage the physical side of the game? Well, they're often, the likes of Edwards. I never saw Edwards, obviously, but the likes of Norman Whiteside's a good example. And Ryan Giggs is a good example. So when you see those two players hit the first team and you see them just taking the mick out of, professional footballers who've been in the game 10 years, automatically you just know that physicality is not going to be an issue. So you could kick Giggs all over the pitch, which they try to do if they could catch him, and it was never an issue. They try to kick Norman Whiteside, he'd just kick you back. So straight away you thought, hang on a minute, physicality is not an issue. Attitude is the next one. Well, attitude's not an issue. So you start ticking these things off, Wayne, and then you talk about the last one, which is, can they handle the pressure? And they had this nonchalance. All of those players had this nonchalance, which was, Ryan Giggs is a good example. They asked him once, did you ever get nervous for a game? He went, no, why would I get nervous? It's just a football match. This is, finals when other people were, Bestie was the same. He never got nervous. So, there's an emotional intelligence there. Ravel never got nervous before a game. He was like, he took everything in his stride. So then you're going to say, what's not going to make them make it then? Because they've got the physicality, they've got the football intelligence, the tactical intelligence, they've got the attitude, they've got the technique. The only thing that's going to make them fail is three things. One is luck. Two is injury, which luck is around managing decisions, and you've got certain clubs that go through managers, like a lot of players during United in the 70s. There was probably 2 or 3 players there that kind of got lost because we had so many managers at the same time, and their career didn't really go the way it was. Andy Ritchie, you could argue, might be one of those.
Yeah.
But going back to your question, and then the third point is, are there some external stuff going on in their life that we don't know about that's going to affect them? And Best had a little bit of that we found out in later life. The Northern Ireland situation, his drink problem, all of that affected his career later on. And we didn't see it early on, but we saw it later on. And you look at players, and with Morrison, he was that player. Since Giggs, Whiteside was one. Hughes and Nicky Butt, I always thought they could make it, but they were different kinds of players. They didn't have the, oh my God, excellence. They didn't turn your head in a way that a Best would, or a Whiteside, if you know what I mean, or a Giggs would. They wouldn't thrill you in the same way. Whiteside and Hughes were just, obviously, and Nicky Butt were just dead certs to make the team because of their approach to the game. But Morrison, he was something else. I've never seen the things he did on a football pitch. And it wasn't selfish play. He was a team player. He had everything. Wayne, I've never seen, I was watching him at 14 and 15, and, he would beat a whole team. And then asked Larnell Cole to make a 30-yard run and then passed to Larnell Cole to put the ball in the back of the net because he couldn't be bothered doing it himself. And he didn't need to do it himself. You know, he was a team player. He was gifted in his passing. His tactical awareness was just out of this world. But when he had the ball, he could do anything. And I remember standing at grounds with friends who you look at each other when he just did something and you're asking yourself, did I just see what I just saw? And they're looking at you going exactly the same thing. Yes, you did, because I just saw it and I'm asking you the same question. And then we have a little giggle saying, I've never seen that before. You know, and there's a YouTube video of him in training with England under 21s where a corner comes in, and perhaps you've seen it, and he puts it in the top corner from a corner, a volley in the corner with a flick. His leg goes like this. I don't know if you've seen the video.
Yeah.
And everyone just stands and look at him, and that's his England youth colleagues. That's how in the hell did you do that? And he was doing that all the time. He was an exceptional footballer that if he didn't have his off the field issues, would have been up there, and he would have been in this team. I would have found a space for him in this team. He could play anywhere in that front six. He really could. So you'd probably be pushing him into he might take Marcus's position, and I might swap, put Hughesy up front and bring, someone else back down. But he would be in there because the world was there for him to take. And unfortunately, some of the stuff in his private life affected his footballing career. But having said that, he's played international football. He's played 200 games, so he's not had a bad career. He just perhaps hasn't had the career that he could have had. And unfortunately, he didn't have the career at Manchester United that we all would have wanted him to have. But wow, what a player! Never seen anything like it. Nothing since Giggs.
Yeah.
And you talk about wingers. If he could have been our right winger for the next 10 or 15 years. Because he had everything.
Yeah, he was. I think you've articulately talked through. He's basically like one of those players where you don't usually get it at youth team. Like you mentioned, Barton, you sort of knew that they had the temperament. Beckham, you sort of knew if Beckham developed a little bit physically, that if he could hold his own, that you knew that he'd be a first team player. But with Morrison, it was like you would watch him. You would watch the game to watch him rather than, I know that player is going to be good. You would turn up like it's the same way that someone would turn up in a game today to watch Ronaldo because you had gone to watch the theatre. Not necessarily, I'm talking about old Ronaldo, but they still do today. They still go today because they want to watch the spectacle of watching Ronaldo play. That was what it was like then because you're watching Ravel Morrison, seeing him play for Manchester United of all clubs and seeing someone of at a club like that and be that far in front, even in a team. I mean, at that time, you had Lingard, who was quite highly rated, Tunnicliffe, who was very highly rated, and Pogba, of course, who was the Will Keane scoring all the goals. So you had a player who, in that side, was still seen as someone far above those players. And wish him all the best. Wayne Rooney obviously knows him well, and he's proven himself to be a good man manager at Derby. We'll see how that goes.
But it's interesting to talk about that 2011 team because what I was just saying about what's going to make a player, I think that team personifies everything that I was talking about. You had Paul Pogba, who on his day could do anything on a football pitch, but his problem was inconsistency. And that was Ferguson's big issue with him. He would go and watch him and he'd be outstanding and then do an average game and then have an anonymous game. And he was doing that at 16, 17, 18. He was inconsistent. And so that inconsistency always means, for me anyway, there was always a doubt. With Jesse, he had the temperament, the skill, tactically. I still think Jesse Lingard is one of the most tactically astute footballers I've ever seen. He's running off the ball in his position. He's to receive the ball is Scholes-esque. With Jesse, it was always about his size and whether or not he would grow. That was always the challenge with him. Will Keane unfortunately got injured, so he had a good career ahead of him. Tunnicliffe was always outstanding, but you always thought what's going to happen when everyone catches up to him in size.
Yeah.
So all of these players, and then some of the others who were under the radar, they're the ones who've actually had the great careers. The Michael Keanes, the Sam Johnstons, they're the ones who have actually gone on to have really good Premier League careers. And that's not saying Pogba and Lingard haven't. Of course they have. They've played 200 odd games for United and that's exceptional. But you kind of think if they'd had what Giggs had in terms of temperament, or in terms of consistency, or what Scholes had, or some of these other players, Lingard and Pogba would have been 10-year careers at United. And it's the same with Morrison, if he could have handled those off the field stuff, and the way that Bestie couldn't do at 26 and 27 either. If they could have handled their off the field activities, they could have had an amazing career. And it's a shame. But that 2011 team, wow, what a team!
Yeah, and what a team yours was, Tony. That 1-11, Jesus, it would take some beating in any youth academy throughout the world. I mean, even your second 11 would be, well, it'd be winning a league title today for sure.
Let me just read out the second 11 because that's interesting. So the second 11 is Dean Henderson, Johnny Carey, Bobby Noble, Billy Fouts, Johnny Evans, David Beckham, Johnny Giles, Norman Whiteside, Ryan Giggs, Stan Pearson, and Marcus Rashford. So that's not a bad youth 11.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's definitely challenging for the title, isn't it? That's how good that side is. If
Imagine
not,
Giles and Whiteside in midfield, blinking hell, you wouldn't want to face those two in midfield for a start. And Beckham, the midfield's really interesting. Giggs, Whiteside, Giles, and Beckham. That's a really strong midfield.
Yeah, can you imagine like facing Scholes and Edwards, and then they come off, and Whiteside and Giles come on? Oh, good grief!
A little anecdote for you before we go. I remember, I don't know if you remember the 1992 League Cup game where we were playing Leicester City and we beat them 5-1 on the night. I don't know if you remember the game, but there was a young fullback for Leicester making his debut at right back, and we had Lee Sharp skinning him, just pushing the ball past him and skinning him, time after time after time. So this kid was they were about 3 or 4-0 down or something, and this kid was he was, you could see his head was gone. So Ferguson brought Sharp off and then put Giggs on. So now this kid who'd just been given a roasting by Sharp suddenly had Giggs to face. So the manager did the right thing and swapped him over to the left fullback. The only problem was Kanchelskis was on the right wing. In the end, the manager, I'm probably got a couple of detail wrong, but eventually the manager just unfortunately had to substitute the kid. So his debut, he had to face Ryan Giggs, Lee Sharp, and Andrei Kanchelskis in a 5-1 defeat. And it was just, so you can imagine what bringing young kids into the team if they're going to face a midfield like that. You're just looking at your head and just shaking yourself and saying, what chance have I got?
Yeah, especially that United side with those three at that time. They were, I think that you could have said that they were the three best wingers in the country anyway. So yeah, well, in fact, yeah, without question. Yeah, oh, Tony, great team. If you're watching back, please feel free to name your youth 11 in the comments and join in on social media as well and tell us what yours would be. We'd be happy to have that discussion with you. That's it for this podcast. If you've been watching live on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to like, subscribe. If you're watching the replay, say hello in the comments. We do still comment and reply to the comments as well. Like and subscribe. If you're listening back on the audio podcast, please subscribe to that and give us a review on the platform you're listening on. Tonight's podcast, on the Friday night podcast, about two players who didn't quite get onto Tony's bench, Lee Lawrence and Phil Marsh. They'll be on tonight's podcast with Keen Freeney.
My apologies. Tell them they were nearly there. They were in my thoughts.
They know that you've had that fight with Lee on social media before. I'm not going to bring it up again now, but they'll be on the podcast tonight with Keen. So yeah, be sure to give that a watch. I think it's 7 o'clock. It'll be on. It might be a little bit later, but look on the Talk of the Devils Twitter feed and also Keen's Twitter feed for that. We will be back very shortly, and I'm pretty sure Tony will be joining me for some podcasts this season. We've got a few tricks up our sleeve with things we're going to talk about. But yeah, just left to be said, thank you for your time, Tony. Really appreciate that. Really great to talk football with you. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please give it a like and subscribe, and we will be back very shortly.